Good afternoon and welcome to Virginia Family Network's June Lunch and Learn. This month, we are going to have a conversation about culturally responsive and inclusive parenting. I'm going to let Dr. Ferguson introduce herself and tell us about parenting culture also.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with you all. And I'm excited to talk about a topic that is really near and dear to me. So I am Dr. Anjali Ferguson. I am a clinical psychologist that is based in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm the founder and president of Parenting Culture. Parenting Culture was a platform that we started in 2021, and it's a resource that is focused on supporting families and providers who work with children on how to be culturally inclusive in our dialogues around children's mental health and raising children. Because the reality is that culture influences a lot of what we do, but we don't have resources or we aren't taught as adults in how we support those things with children. So we created Parenting Culture, and it's a free resource. We are a team of psychologists of color who are all parents ourselves. And we curate these guides and fact sheets for you to kind of help you have conversations around difficult topics like race or gender identity development, topics or issues related to reproductive rights, how to be affirming in our parenting practices, you name it, we've got it on there for you, and it's free. We also have a podcast series if you're interested in hearing information presented in a different way. And we've got several other products like a children's book that's associated with the platform too. But like I said, today we're going to focus on culturally responsive and inclusive parenting, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that means as we go through this. And I wanted to start first with just talking through what I mean when I say culture. A lot of times when we think about culture, folks think of a couple of things, like we think of gender or we think of race as being these primary things that we use to describe somebody's culture or their cultural identity. But the reality is every single one of us, even if you're not from a historically marginalized or a minoritized background, have culture. Culture is influenced by a number of layers that are all impacted by different behaviors or different interactions that we've had in life over time. So our culture is impacted by the people we meet, the environments we live in, the regions of the country we live in, maybe the amount of education we have or don't have, maybe our access to things like healthcare or access to food. All of that really informs our values and our beliefs. We then absorb this information and we apply it to ourselves and we build our identity over time. Culture is really important because every single one of us, like I said, have culture, and culture can be really fluid over time too. That means our culture or our cultural identity can actually change over time. We kind of are flexible as human beings, we're flexible, and what we absorb from one year to the next could be really different and really change our worldviews. And our children are the same way. They also develop culture based off of what they're exposed to, the people around them, the media that they're consuming, and their culture is also very fluid and flexible over time. Our identity to culture also changes across development. So how a child identifies with different aspects of culture in their childhood or early childhood might look really different from how they identify with various aspects of their culture in adolescence or even adulthood. It's really important for us as adults to know that how our child develops their culture and cultural identity can also be very different from what we expect as parents or how we view culture ourselves. So one of the monumental tasks for us as parents is for us to be cognizant of those expectations, and we stay flexible and open to the differences that our children might be expressing in front of us. But these things like race, these things like gender identity often come as like heavy topics. And people often ask me, why do we need to talk about this in childhood? Kids are too young to understand this material. We think it's too early to expose them to these things. And I'm here to tell you that that's actually not true. The reality is, and we've got a lot of science to back this, kids actually notice race-based differences as early as 6 months of age. Some kids notice it as early as 4 months of age. They start to recognize differences in race. By the time a child is 2 to 4 years old, children can internalize or kind of become a bit set in those racial biases that they have or view or experience. By the time a child is 10 to 12 years old, they become pretty firmly set in what their racial beliefs are. 10 to 12 years is not a lot of time for us to kind of change racial biases or change racial beliefs. So we do have to have conversations regarding race and culture pretty early in development. The same is true with gender. Gender identity development and gender exploration is actually a really typical part of childhood. So you might remember even as a child, maybe a little boy playing in your mommy's shoes or wanting to put nail polish on or explore what wearing a dress might be like. All that's really typical. And children start this gender identity and gender exploration process as early as 2 years of age. That's when children can start to notice physical differences in our bodies. By 3, kids actually start to label themselves as boy or girl. And again, they might play around with those labels and play around with those identities often during this age. And by 4 years of age, most children actually have a pretty firm understanding of their gender identity. And they kind of know how fluid or not fluid they're going to be, or how explorative or not explorative they might be. Of course, this is always influenced by the culture in the household and culture in society about how safe a child might feel in expressing those things. But it's important for us to know as parents that many times people know pretty early. So I mentioned that this onus or responsibility of allowing our kids to explore culture, understand culture, starts again really early. Just like we take it upon ourselves to know that it's our job to make sure our kids learn their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, it's also our responsibility to make sure we teach kids about their culture, support their cultural identity, and evolve with them as their identity evolves over time. This is even more of an issue of importance these days, because what we are seeing with a lot of the data nationally and statewide, which we're going to move to here in a second, is that children from marginalized backgrounds, or those from cultures who have experienced oppression or experienced systemic oppressions in different ways, so maybe folks from racially minoritized backgrounds or folks from gender diverse groups like LGBTQ plus communities, kiddos from those communities experience some of the greatest levels of mental health distress. And what we know after the pandemic is that these issues just increased exponentially for these marginalized groups. So we found that following the pandemic, 13% of children reported experiencing 4 or more ACEs during COVID. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences that are linked to traumatic events and traumatic stressors. When we look at ACEs, 4 becomes a magic number because that gets tied with health outcomes later in adulthood. So if you have 4 or more ACEs, it increases your risk for the development of things like heart disease, cancer, diabetes in adulthood. And during the pandemic, many of our kiddos started to experience more and more ACEs. More than 40% of children felt persistently sad or hopeless following the pandemic and during the pandemic. And more than 22% seriously considered attempting suicide, with 10% actually attempting. Now, these feelings or these mental health challenges were exacerbated or more prominent in children of color and those from LGBTQ backgrounds or communities, with LGBTQ plus students, female students, and those from racially minoritized groups exhibiting the most need or the most mental health concerns. Nearly half of LGBTQ plus youth seriously considered attempting suicide in 2021, which was far more than our or cis youth. Black youth were much more likely to attempt suicide than students of other racially minoritized groups. Now, we recently conducted a needs assessment across the state of Virginia to see how these impacted kids in our state. And what we found were pretty similar results to date. So although we are kind of on the recovery from some of the COVID-19 pandemic impacts, we are still entering a mental health epidemic of sorts. And what we found with the data that we collected in Virginia is that parents and educators are noticing a 50% increase in depression in youth, a 59% increase of anxiety symptoms in youth, 46% of ADHD symptomatology, and 62% of behavioral problems in the youth in our state. Along with that, many parents and educators are also reporting concerns related to gender and racial discrimination across the state, with 51% feeling that LGBTQ plus youth experience a significant amount of gender discrimination, and 59% feeling that racially minoritized youth experience a significant amount of race-based discrimination. Why is this important? We know through much of our science that discrimination based off of race and culture and gender identity can have some pretty lasting mental health impacts that can have a trauma response in individuals. So when you continue to face these types of stressors, it can really wear on our bodies, which can also impact our health outcomes, like I mentioned, and our mental health outcomes. It can present like PTSD if you are continually experiencing discrimination. And a majority of the participants in our study felt that our youth are at risk for gender and race-based discrimination if they are from marginalized backgrounds, which is a concern for us. Another thing that we found was that in our sample, 50% of participants reported having youth at home or interactions with youth who were representative of the LGBTQ plus community. 74% of our participants had interactions with or had youth themselves who were racially minoritized, and 59% felt that discrimination again was a problem. 54% of our participants were concerned about how current policies and legislation might be impacting or contributing to some of the discrimination that they were seeing. And they felt that the current perceived discriminatory policies do in fact have a significant impact on the mental health outcomes that they were noticing an uptick in. So when we asked them to describe what they think were the main concerns that our youth face today in this state, the top three themes that came out were traumatic stress or trauma or stressful life events, social isolation or exclusion, and lacking support within schools, outside of schools, pretty much in every setting. When we asked them to report on additional concerns, they noted that they felt that discrimination again was a big piece of what our youth were facing. They felt that peer relationships were pretty strained following COVID, with an increase in bullying and peer pressure and peer conflict. Substance use was a noted issue. Violence, which included community violence and relating to bullying, individually based violence as well, and mental health outcomes, like I said before. So we know that much of our youth, or those especially from high risk populations, are those who are minoritized or marginalized. They are experiencing high rates of discrimination or traumatic stress that could be impacting their mental health needs. And it's something that families are noticing and educators are noticing too. And this is a concern for us because what do we do about this? We have to do something about this. There is a need for us to address these issues. And there are ways for us to do that. as caregivers. What we can do at home is we can start to become more humble and responsive to culture and cultural needs of our youth. Because as a generation, we are just becoming much more racialized in society. And that's due to a lot of things. If we think of the type of exposure that we have today with access to things like the internet and social media, our youth are getting a lot of exposure to ideas and things and just growing and absorbing and building their identities that way. So we are just becoming a more and more multicultural society as we continue. And we're only going to become more multicultural as we progress. So it's important for us as adults to embrace that evolution and start to change our expectations of what we need to do within the home. And we have to do this early because we're seeing that in adolescence, if we don't start these conversations early or if we don't put these supports in early, in adolescence, our youth are really struggling because they don't know how to manage and navigate all of these identities that they are trying to grapple with. So that brings us to what the talk was titled as. We were here to talk about cultural responsiveness and inclusion, which gets tied into this idea of humility as well. So for a long, long time in mental health, we used to tell folks that you had to be competent in culture. We would call it cultural competence. But the reality is that we can never really be competent in culture. We can't really be competent in our own culture, let alone a culture that we're less familiar with. So now what we encourage folks to do is to be humble in recognizing that we are actively learning. We are always going to be learning, and we have to be open to that process of learning. That's cultural humility. And that openness and humility is important because that helps us be responsive to cultural needs that come up and helps us be more fluid or flexible to different cultural demands that might come up for our kiddos. So how do we build cultural humility in ourselves? First, it starts with awareness. We have to become aware of our blind spots, the biases that we might have, the privileges that we might have, and every single one of us have biases and privileges, myself included. Even me being considered a quote unquote expert in this realm, I too have biases and privileges I'm learning every single day. We have to, again, be open to that learning process, like I mentioned, stay curious about differences instead of fearful or avoidant of things that are different from us, which is our innate response to things. When we see something that we're unfamiliar with, our protective response is avoid it or disengage or have a fear-based response that might criticize it. We want to avoid those things. We want to be open and sit with some of that discomfort and the learning that we might feel. The other piece is this commitment to growth, right? So I've talked about this fluidity of culture that happens. That means that this isn't a sit down once and figure it out process. You're going to have to keep having these conversations and this internal dialogue throughout life. Because like I said, we as a society are becoming much more multicultural. We are evolving throughout over time. 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, culture can look really different. So we're going to have to keep learning and growing with that. So unfortunately, this isn't a take one course or hear me speak once and be done, right? We're going to have to keep practicing these things in our own time with a lot of intention. So cultural responsiveness, what does that mean then? Now you know what humility looks like. Cultural responsiveness is the actual act, right? And how you interact with the other individual. In this case, we're talking about our kiddos. How do we be responsive to our kiddos? When they come to us and they bring us this cultural information, or they bring us these issues related to culture that we just aren't prepped for, what do we do? Stay flexible, because how you might have viewed your culture or how you developed your cultural identity 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago is really different from how they're navigating it now. So what worked for you might not work for them, and that's okay. So remember that one size doesn't fit all. And again, be flexible in learning with them about what will actually work for them. Assess your blind spots. Similar to kind of knowing our biases and privileges, we have to stay aware of how we are going to tolerate or not tolerate new information, and then what we do with that and how that impacts our interactions with our kids. So for example, if your child comes to you and they tell you that they are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, they come out to you. Some of us are likely going to have some type of emotional response to that. It's important that we manage what that emotional response is in how we interact with our child, because we want them to still feel safe and comforted in coming to us to have these dialogues of really difficult topics. If we come in and center our emotions, we're pushing our kids away, and they're not going to come to us as a safe space to have dialogue related to culture. So it's really important we know what our blind spots are so that when they come up, we don't overreact or we don't put our emotions onto our kiddos. We want to actively incorporate culture. And like I said, all of us have culture. So some of us need to do some unpacking into what does culture mean to me? Because maybe we haven't sat down and actually thought through that. I am a South Asian woman, and sometimes our South Asian culture is really prominent and in your face. And then there's other aspects of our South Asian culture that I've had to unpack a little bit more as I've become a parent myself. And I always tell my white colleagues and friends, white people have culture too. You guys have culture too. And that's important to know. You bring culture to the table. And what about your culture represents you? And what do you resonate with? It's important you know that, because then the more firm you become in your identity, the more willing you are to hear things that are different from you. It actually helps you build your self-esteem then when you are faced with differences, if you know who you are to the core. So kind of unpacking that a little bit informs things a little bit more, and also helps inform the needs that your child might have in the interactions that you all have as they unpack the different layers for themselves. And the last one is, for this is race specific, and we are going to talk about gender today as well. But one of the pieces that's really important is that we make the space to have these conversations related to race and culture. And I said this earlier, but a lot of us defer to or default to, kids can't handle it. Why am I going to bring it up? This is uncomfortable. The reality is it's uncomfortable for us, not them. They are curious. They want language at a young age. I can tell you my 3-year-old already asks me, what am I? And he wants to know, am I Indian like mommy or am I Black like daddy? And we have conversations all the time about how he's both. And he's only 3, but we're trying to help him better navigate what his culture is, because he sees the differences in us. He sees the differences in our families, how we celebrate things differently, even though we do it together. He's curious. So we're helping put words to that instead of saying, you're too young to figure this out. You'll figure it out when you're an adult, right? That's dismissing them. We want to keep the conversation and the door open so that when they do have difficulties outside of the home, they come to us to help support them through that. If they don't, again, feel like we are safe in the home, when they are navigating these really difficult challenges, or they're facing things like discrimination at school or outside of school, we want them to come to us and say, I need help with this. And if we keep the door open, that's how we're going to lay that foundation. So we have to model that for them. So when it comes to race or other racialized types of culture, what are some things that we can do as parents? I mentioned this a little bit, but one thing that we can be really intentional about with our kids from a young age is making sure we acknowledge and celebrate differences. A lot of times we are teaching kids to look for similarities in friends but it's also really important we teach them to acknowledge and celebrate differences, because differences are what make each of us unique. And if we can start to give them that messaging, it helps empower them when they face kids who are different from them, which all of us are going to face in life. Like I tell everybody I talk to or work with, every interaction you have is a cultural experience, because there's not going to be a single person on this planet that's going to have the same exact cultural experiences as you. Not even your siblings, not even your parents, because there are a lot of intersections as to why and how you develop your identity and how it's unique. So every person you meet is a cultural experience. And the only way we get comfortable with that is if we embrace when things are different from us instead of feeling threatened by the difference. So we want to teach kids the same thing. And we can teach them that by, again, reminding them that that's what makes them unique. We can tell them that our differences are our superpowers. It's what makes us special. And we can remind them that we welcome differences in our home. We like when people are different. That helps us see new perspectives and teach us new things. Again, this can start really early in development. The next thing is, because it is human nature and it's a part of development, especially in early childhood, for kids to build friendships based off of commonalities, we want them to learn commonalities that are not culture or race specific. So we want them to learn that a person is so much more than what we see on the outside, that we also have these other commonalities with them because of who they are as people. And it's important we're explicit about that too, because our kids are going to be quick to tell you, hey, your skin is a little darker than her skin, or mommy, why is your hair straight but daddy's is curly? And it's important we, again, validate that we acknowledge they notice that difference. Like, you're right, you guys do have different skin colors, or you're right, you do have different kinds of hair. And you know why you're both friends? Because you both really love to play with dinosaurs, or you really love to play with trucks. Reminding them that the reason you have this relationship is not because of the culture or what you see on the outside, but more, again, of what's on the inside. Another thing, and this goes back to that building of cultural identity, because if we explore our cultural identity and we become more firm in what that is, we've just then, again, become more accepting of differences in other people's culture and identity. We want to expose our kids to media from our culture. We want them to build pride in that. We want them to feel prideful and build their self-esteem related to those types of content, so that they want to share that with others too. They're not ashamed of sharing it with others. They celebrate it. So we want to think of representation of what our own culture is in our household, but we also want to make sure we represent other cultures too. So when we're thinking of books or TV shows or movies, toys, we want to make sure that we're really helping our kid know who they are, where they're from, and that there's diversity out there, so that our shelves don't look all of one colored doll, or all trucks and balls and gender specific toys for boys. We want that diversity so kids have the opportunity to explore and see those differences, because in doing so, it helps build a sense of belonging again for our kids, and it helps, again, build up self-esteem, which is really important. And a big part of when we socialize with people who are different from us, then we become much more accepting if we are firm in our identity. So I want to move a little bit to how do we support gender identity development as parents. One of the biggest things for me is looking at our current statistics, which is a bit disheartening, because if you ask LGBTQ plus youth or LGBTQ plus folks, 60% of them report not having supportive caregivers in their lifetime. And folks with supportive caregivers, even just one supportive adult in a child's life, lowers the rates of depression, anxiety, trauma, and suicidal ideation significantly. And our LGBTQ plus youth are at the greatest risk for suicidal ideation and attempting and completing suicide. This is a preventable thing. These are things that we can prevent as caregivers in their lives by being more cognizant of and much more affirming of their lives and their choices and their decisions and their trajectory, their identities. So, how do we do that? It's actually quite simple and hard at the same time. Something can be simple but difficult to do. What it involves for us is really managing and shifting and being cognizant of our expectations. We also, again, going back to exposure, want to make sure we're exposing our kids to gender diverse content from a young age. We want kids to know that there's no one correct type of family, that you can have all types of different constellations of families. There's all different types of ways of being. Boys don't always play with trucks. Boys don't always like the color blue. There's lots of things that you can play with and colors that you can like. And the same continues well into adolescence too. If our kids are exploring their gender in different ways, we want to avoid shaming them for that gender exploration. We want to stay curious in learning with them. And it's important that we correct harmful adults who might be in their lives, because it's, again, when we see something that's different or something we're not used to, our fear response kicks in, we become critical, which in turn turns harmful. And even if you're being really affirming in your household and you're trying to be supportive of your kid, they might encounter an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or somebody else who might say or do things that are harmful. It's important that we correct that, because we are their ally, their accomplice. We want them to know that we are in their corner. So it's important we make sure we are taking that responsibility to correct others. The other thing that we want to do is we want to make sure we provide our kiddos with resources to gender diverse communities. And again, from a young age, this could be things like making sure we're exposing them in June to Pride events, taking them to Pride events, supporting Pride events, supporting LGBTQ plus businesses year round, making sure we're donating, attending community events that are LGBTQ plus just beyond June, and making sure our kids are seeing it in the media and everywhere else. And the last thing we want to make sure we do is also use gender affirming language at home. So sometimes what I hear from parents with this is it's tough. Like, as our kids are exploring their identity, their pronouns might change from month to month or week to week. That's all a part of the process. And I know it can get frustrating and confusing sometimes, but we have to just try. We have to try our best to kind of keep up with it and use the language that our kids would like for us to use as they figure this out, because they are just trying to figure out what fits and what works best and what feels right for them. And we want to make sure we are not impacting their mental health in a negative way because we're refusing to join them on that journey. So, lastly, the biggest thing when it comes to this cultural responsiveness is pride. And I've talked about race today and gender today. And again, culture can mean so many different things. We could unpack this from an immigration standpoint, from a socioeconomic standpoint, from a regional standpoint. But at the end of the day, one of the biggest things is pride, because for socially marginalized, historically marginalized, racially marginalized, gender discriminated, for people from marginalized backgrounds, we experience stigma and discrimination, like I mentioned, constantly. And that discrimination and that stigma and bias really starts to wear away at our being and our presence and who we are as a person. So the way in which that discrimination works is its goal is to tear us down. And in that tearing down process is how mental health effects start to develop as a result. What pride does, what building our cultural identity does, is it very directly combats that process, because it helps our kids let them know that we see them for who they are, we see them for their identity, whether it be gender identity or racial identity, what have you. And it helps them know that we are supporting it and we are celebrating it. And pride and joy are one of the strongest ways to combat this type of cultural-based traumas that kiddos experience. And we can really build that in the household. I always tell my partner, there's little that we can control in the world outside of our home. So if we were to focus on one thing in our home, it's building joy. Like, I want my kid to feel immense joy when he walks into this house and know that he is loved unconditionally as he's developing, because the world is going to be tough when he enters that world. And the only way he's going to be able to combat that is if he knows home is safe and prideful and joyful, so that he can face those other things head on. Other things that we should remember, and are just facts: you're going to stumble through this. You're going to make mistakes. You're probably going to cause harm from time to time, but no one expects you to get it right all the time. Nobody wants perfection. That is just unattainable. None of us are perfect in this. And the reality is, all of us are making mistakes every other day along the way. All our youth want in this process is to be seen and heard, to feel loved and supported, and to feel like you're trying. That even though you're making these mistakes, you're going to try better the next time. And you're going to try better the time after that. And you're just going to keep trying. You're there with them, and you're going to keep trying. That's all they want from us. So while sometimes it feels like this massive mountain to climb or this huge hurdle ahead of us, it really just distills down to these three things, which you're probably doing in a lot of ways, some of which we can maybe do a little bit more intentionally. So that is all I have for you. As I mentioned, we have free resources at parentingculture.org. If you'd like some help in how to navigate these conversations across development, we've got several different guides for you on there. And then you're always welcome to email us or reach out to us. We've also got an Instagram handle that you can check out with some more abbreviated content from time to time. But I appreciate your time, and I'm willing to answer any questions that folks have.
So I'm going to put those links into the chat box so they know exactly where to find you and to find all these great resources. I think this was such a great conversation to have, and especially the time that we're having it. We're right at the end of Pride Month, but next month is also Mental Health or Minority Mental Health Awareness Month.
Yep.
So we're right there in between these two really strong months where this is going to really help drive it home and make sense. A lot of our parent leaders who help do many, many things for Virginia Family Network, we talk a lot about culture within different families and how going into someone's house as you're helping these families, like, you have to be very mindful of their culture. So I think this really gives lots of advice and help and came at the most perfect timing.
That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. And yes, if folks who are tuning in are interested, if you're a provider and you're more interested in providing culturally responsive services, that is something I have expertise in training folks in, and we provide trainings nationally often on how to do that and how to apply that with the families that we work with. It's something that we're taught to do and not often taught how to do it. So we try and teach a little bit more of like how to apply those principles. So please don't hesitate to reach out if that's something you or your organization are looking for.
Wonderful. So I don't have any other questions. Nothing came up while you were speaking. So I want to thank you for being able to join me today. Again, this was such a great conversation to have, and I look forward to hopefully being able to do more with you.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me. It was wonderful. I hope those of you listening in gained some nugget of something to take home. But please follow us and reach out if you're interested in more. And thank you again.
Thank you so much.